Alright, so this is a quick video to update my progress in French using Anki, the Fluent Forever method, and other methods that I have been reading about. So why don't we jump straight down to my statistics of my cards so far. This is after 60 days of studying French without missing a day. So let's go down and see. So right now, I'll click on for the full year. That's for 2 months worth. I have a total of 2,225 cards, which represents 1,244 notes, which is a rough approximate number of unique words that I know in French. Now, I say approximate because it's not strictly true, because there will be some repetition of words like de, or du, or le, or la, or a, or a la, or little grammar words that I have put in repeatedly because in my brain it looks like a unique pattern. So for example, the difference between à ouvrir versus à la menthe, or something like that. Again, sorry for my pronunciation. Um, because I don't actually know what the rule is between those two different situations, but I want to make sure that when I spot it, I can understand that what it means and just be able to recognize that pattern in a sentence. And so, like I said, I'll sometimes repeat words like de or du or de la when it's not immediately obvious to my brain why we're using that particular word. I might have a generalized idea of why, but if it seems like a unique situation with those kind of grammar connecting words, I'll add that as an additional card. So that's why I say it's approximate. Also, I've been starting to add words like just for le and la with closed deletion in a sentence. And so that takes up some of them, but that's not a huge amount. I don't know what the actual number is, but I'm sure at this point the actual unique words that I know, is over 1,000. Now that, again, that's not just word families, that's any version of a word. So again, that number might be slightly lower as well. So for example, faire, I'll have fait, F-A-I-T, versus fait, F-A-I-S, as separate quote-unquote words. But that's not, often when people talk about unique words, they're talking more about word families like faire, that's uh, that represents every single possible version of that, and you wouldn't double count it. But I am, because in my brain they're different words. They have different functions and uses, and so yeah, technically, when people say how many words do you know, they don't usually double count words that way. But I don't think it's particularly useful to not count them because it's they're different words just like any other word, right? It's almost like synonyms. Just because you know like different words that could mean bicycle, for example. Some of them might be formal, sometimes informal, sometimes French specific, some Quebec specific, and it's not considered double counting. Whereas different verb forms are not considered, it would be double counting to refer to the different conjugations as separate words. I don't know. I don't think that's particularly useful. So, long story short, 1,244 are the different notes that I have, and those represent roughly the number of words with all those caveats that I just said. So let's look at my statistics in terms of my percentage correct using Anki. So let's look over the current year, the last 2 months total. My average accuracy rate for brand new cards I've never seen before is 92.95%, which is fine. That number, I don't think it's actually all that important because it's really, once you've learned it for once, all that really matters is this percentage of the learning cards and the mature cards. Because if you mess it up initially when you first are trying to review it, it's not really necessary to, like, it doesn't matter actually. Once you've got it correct once, now you want to think, oh, can I actually remember it moving forward? Um, and so, yeah, that's that's the way I view that. Now, last month I didn't actually have any mature cards that I reviewed, but now I have statistics about how well I'm retaining information that I only see every three weeks or more. So currently my percentage for mature cards is 97.59%, which is great because the goal is above 90%. As long as you're hitting above 90%, you're fine. It doesn't matter whether it's between 90 or 93% or 96%. And if you start to see that it's trending downward towards 90 and potentially even below, then that could potentially be a problem. But as of now, it's not. Now, what's interesting is that my retention rate for the learning cards has actually increased over the last month. And I'll explain why that is in a second. But so for the whole amount of time I've been studying, the percentage correct for learning is 97.98%. But just the last month, my average is 98.5%, so 1% better, which means that the last month I've actually been able to remember things much better than the very first month. And my theory for that is that because I'm using exclusively just sentence cards, where I'll have a sentence like, Le chat est dans la boîte. The cat is in the box. And in that example, that's a very easy thing to remember, that sentence, whereas the word for boîte might be more difficult just by itself. But because it's in the context of this little story, this sentence, it's so much easier to memorize and to retain, not only the whole sentence, but the individual words, even after several weeks. I still remember there's my favorite sentence that's totally useless, but I always remember. And again, my pronunciation I think is getting better, but it's still quite bad right now. I'm mostly not focused on speaking, mostly just input. But so my favorite sentence is l'entreprise a construit une nouvelle centrale nucléaire. So the business had constructed a new nuclear power plant. So like some of those words are not very useful, but that story is very incredibly memorable in my brain for whatever reason. If I was trying to remember the word for power plant, centrale, or even for nucléaire, even though it's a cognate, I probably would have forgotten it and not have remembered it. But having that sentence is super memorable. But yeah, so again, looking back in the statistics, for the last month, all my percentages are higher other than the mature because I didn't have statistics the previous month. So 98.5%, but even my learning brand new cards is higher. So overall, for the year, it's 92.95%. But for just this month, it's 94.64%, which means that that first month was quite a bit lower than 92%, probably around 90%. So clearly, the methods I'm doing now are more effective. Sentences, and this is something everyone already knows. Remembering sentences is better than remembering individual words. Not only do you learn the grammar that way, but it's so much easier to remember through context rather than isolated words. Again, that's not a revelation. I think most people who have been learning a language would know that, but it's been clearly the statistics show that that is true. So if we're doing this scientifically, the statistics show that sentences are better at retention than individual words, based on my experience. Now, I haven't done an A/B test versus in terms of do pictures aid in memory as well for the flashcards, as well as like sound files. Does that help? And I don't think it's particularly useful to do those tests because I just want to learn quick, and the current method I'm doing seems to be effective. And to be honest, it doesn't take that much time to add pictures and audio. Like it takes a bit of takes a bit of time. It's a investment of time, but I think it's good for many reasons. So, and if the results are good, then why change the method? Now, currently, I actually hit a great milestone where I finally finished the Fluent Forever top 625 words list. So this is part of the Fluent Forever method. If you don't know about that, the idea is after learning pronunciation, at least being able to start recognizing the sounds in the general spelling system, you're supposed to learn the top 625 words according to this specific list. Let's see if I can find it. Okay, so this is your first 625 words you should learn in a foreign language according to Gabriel Weiner and the Fluent Forever method. And it's mostly just a bunch of easy to visualize nouns and verbs and adjectives. So things like color, computer, cow, election, explode, all that stuff. That what it does is it doesn't teach you the language. You can't speak after you learn these words, but it gives you a baseline of knowledge. It gives you a foundation of words so that once you move beyond this list and you start reading more, you start working through grammar books, and you start listening to TV and movies and native material, it becomes so much easier because you have this base of knowledge. And this probably brings me to the language paradox that I like to think about, where I think it's pretty common knowledge that the best way to learn a language is to consume lots of native material, to immerse yourself in the language, to read a lot, to watch a lot of television in the language, to talk to native speakers, and that's how you learn. That's pretty uncontroversial. I think everyone would agree with that. The problem is you have to hit an intermediate level so that that is actually effective and actually efficient. Because let's just take reading for example. The top 1,000 words in any language usually covers around 70% of the language. So if you just read enough, you actually never have to really learn those words from scratch because they just come up all the time. Unfortunately, if you're a beginner, you don't have enough knowledge about French to actually read, and so you're going to have to constantly look up words. But because you're constantly looking up words, you're going to be reading very slowly. And so you're not going to be able to read fast enough to not forget the words that you're learning. Because the thing is with when you read, it's in a way it's sort of less efficient than an Anki system like this, but it's a deeper sense of learning because you're making so many connections to these stories and lots of different examples using very simple words like un or le or la or souvent or pendant or like simple words that we use all the time in French or people use all the time in French. But the problem is, again, you won't be able to read fast enough because you're constantly having to look up words in order to even understand what you're reading so that you can get that benefit of making these connections to these stories that you're reading. So it's like a catch-22. The only way to improve and become good at a language is to read and watch a lot of the language. But when you're a beginner, you're not able to do that, and you're not able to actually read and watch things fast enough to actually prevent yourself from forgetting. And so, what's the solution to the paradox? Well, there's two. You can just have an intensive, immersive environment with a teacher that guides you and basically makes it so you never forget by giving you enough comprehensible input that the basics just get reinforced very quickly and so that you don't, it's reinforced in a way that you won't forget it, and then you can start building on that. So you get to an intermediate level fairly quickly in an intense, immersive environment with a teacher that can guide you towards that. But most people, like if you go to, Gabriel Weiner always talks about a school in Vermont, Middlebury, I think it's called, where it's something like that, where it's you're not allowed to say English at all. You just have to talk and communicate in your target language, and they have instructors to guide you with comprehensible input and talking practice and stuff like that. So in those situations, you don't have time to forget because you're just constantly being reinforced. But if you're just self-studying, reading by yourself, or just watching TV without that guide, you're not going to be able to read enough, really, at least at the beginning, to prevent you from forgetting. Now, you probably, if you powered through it, eventually you could do it, but it would be incredibly painful and incredibly time-consuming because it's so inefficient because you don't know anything. So the solution to the paradox is Anki, or flashcards, or something self-study like that, where you basically lodge in your brain these words, this baseline of words, like the top 625 words, for example, so that it's not, even when you've reviewed it several times or you've been able to remember it over the course of a month or 2 months, it's still not a very deep memory or deep bit of knowledge, right? It's still very much in that specific context of that flashcard. But I'll talk about Matt versus Japan and AJAT in a few minutes, but this guy named Matt versus Japan on YouTube, he talks about this idea of a mental dictionary. The idea is that once you have that mental dictionary of a specific French word, you can always add to it. But it's that initial creation of that entry which is the difficult part. And that's what Anki is very efficient at. By creating these flashcards and these example sentences, you've created a mental dictionary entry for things like l'hiver, the winter, for example, hiver. Um, now that so now, do I understand that in every context or how it's used, and maybe idiomatic expressions or things like that? No, of course not. But at least I have that mental dictionary entry in my brain, and so that if I ever come across it while reading or listening, all that will do, the reading and listening will reinforce that initial memory that Anki kind of created, like I said, very efficiently in a very organized way. And so there's the solution to the paradox. Until you get to an intermediate level, you should be studying with Anki or some kind of spaced repetition system to very efficiently memorize the key words, like in a frequency list, or use Gabriel Weiner's list. And then until you get to a certain point where you have a you have a certain level of words, you hit a certain level where you kind of tip over to the intermediate level, where now it's very efficient to start reading and watching a lot. Now, and so that's the solution. And most people, for example, argue, people debate of to what extent, how many words you have to get to like really like quote unquote know before you hit that intermediate level. Sean Crowder, I believe his name is. He's a drummer who uh, he sometimes plays with Adam Neely on YouTube. He said for Italian it was about 2,000 words, and I think that's using the words in terms of word family, which makes about sense. I wouldn't say I'm anywhere near intermediate right now because I'm about halfway there. But if I had twice the amount of French knowledge, I could see potentially the idea of being at an intermediate level and being able to get more out of watching and listening and reading. Now, am I doing reading and watching practice now? I am. I was inspired by, well, I was inspired by the very strange and bizarre AJAC community, which is, if you don't know, it's all Japanese all the time, which is very much based on the input hypothesis, the idea that you learn a language not through conscious knowledge, but through acquisition of tons and tons of native material. And they use Anki as well in a slightly different way. They don't use closed deletion as much, I don't think, but I don't really understand their system, honestly. But it's the same basic idea. You use Anki to basically jumpstart your memorization of the language to give you kind of a foothold until you get to an intermediate level where you actually get much more benefit just from doing a lot of reading and listening practice, and you'll actually acquire vocabulary very, very quickly as a result, while still doing Anki for difficult or rare words. Um, but their whole system is quite bizarre, to be honest, and a little extreme and not very practical. But I was inspired by it, and I've been starting to. I I wanted to start now immersing myself in French. So I've been watching TV shows. I've been watching Teen Titans Go on Netflix, which is pretty funny, but I got a little tired of it after a while. It's a little silly, but initially it was very very difficult. But after a while, yeah, your ear kind of just tunes to it, and even if you don't know the words, you can hear the word they're saying. At least my brain is tricking myself into thinking I can hear the word, that it's not just blah, blah, gibberish. And then after a while, you start picking out words that you actually know. And once you start learning little phrases. Like there's a phrase bien sûr, which means of course. Again, I don't think I was pronouncing that well, bien sûr, or d'accord, or like okay. And little words like little phrases that are used all the time that I never put in a flashcard, but I just learned naturally through watching this material. And people just say, or qu'est-ce que tu fais? What are you doing? They use that a lot in cartoons for some reason. And so you learn little words like that. I hope that was correct, actually, but that general kind of sentence means that. And and yeah, you actually do surprise learn even when you're a beginner like me, you learn a surprising amount just through that immersion and watching. And the thing is, it's going to be hard at the beginning, no matter what level you're at. Even if you wait until you're quote unquote intermediate level, if you haven't been consuming a lot of native material, you're never actually going to get your ear used to listening to it at that rate and thinking about how people actually say sentences in French. One thing that I definitely agree with in the AJAT world is this idea that you don't learn how to speak by learning a grammar rule and then basically in a laboratory constructing a sentence based on those rules. You use those grammar rules to understand native material to help you understand, like why are we using it in this order. It helps you make sense of it, but you only actually learn to speak based on what you've already heard from native material or what you've read, and which makes a lot of sense to me because in English that's not how we learned. We learned through repetition, through just listening and copying sentences. And sometimes when we're constructing sentences, like in our writing and formal writing, we'll write a sentence and then think, does this sound weird? Is this kind of strange? Like it makes sense what it says, but it's a little strange. Maybe if I change it around, it'll sound a little less odd. But but yeah, in general, in a language, at least in English, there's very specific ways the way we say things, and that if you say it slightly off, it's very obvious to a native that it doesn't make any you're not a native speaker, and that it's very strange. So, for example, just like I need to use the washroom. You know, that is one way of saying go to the bathroom. You could say I need to walk to the room where there's a toilet and use that thing. If you said it like that, you would sound like an alien, even though it makes perfect sense. And so to actually sound like you know how to speak the language, you have to be able to listen to how people actually say certain things idiomatically to that language. And it's so, like every sentence, like you read actual native material, it's so idiomatic to the language that there's always a specific way they say certain things. And there's also like a variety of specific ways they do it. But if you just kind of look at grammar stuff and then decide, I'm going to say a sentence based on those rules, it's probably going to sound weird and wrong because no native speaker would ever say anything like that. And I think that makes a lot of sense to me. I think it makes total sense. You do have to learn grammar to help you understand the material, but really it's just read a lot, listen to a lot so that you can see how people actually say things. And and yeah, I think that's kind of an interesting insight. Again, I don't think the AJAT system makes a lot of sense in terms of practicality. Most people can't devote 24/7 of their life to a language. But this idea of study mixed with immersion, of both listening without subtitles to like media, as well as practicing reading, I think makes total sense. In fact, it's hard to even think of an alternative. Um, Another thing that AJAP people talk about is input versus output. That you should absorb tons and tons of input, like 10,000 sentences or 10,000 hours of media. I don't know what their actual amount is, but it's a huge amount before you actually should start talking. The idea is that again, you don't want to start saying sentences that are very weird and non-idiomatic to the language. Um, that being said, though, I think people since then have talked about how it's okay to use output, but only if you know for sure that that's how a French person would say it. Maybe there's an example sentence of how someone said, of course, bien sûr, or d'accord, or like, how are you doing? Comment ça va? Like, instead of constructing the sentence by thinking how and are and doing and stuff, you just know that phrase and that's what that means. Comment ça va? Or bien sûr, or bientôt, or à bientôt, or all these little phrases that French people say that you just learn through repetition. And so if you've like picked up on that through watching media or reading, it's of course okay to practice because being able to recall those things in real time to represent your thoughts is actually a separate skill from understanding media. But I think the lesson though is that you should have had a lot of exposure to those ideas and how to say those things before you attempt to say it yourself. That's to avoid sounding like a robot or building bad habits. Um, yeah, anyways, the long story short, I finished that 625 word list, the one by Gabriel Weiner. Uh, I'm gonna kind of increase the amount I'm studying this week so that I can get through the list by the end of this week. As you can see, I have 256 cards that are not viewed yet. I switched Anki to French just to immerse myself a little bit more, but I have 256 cards, which means I upped the amount I'm actually reviewing for new cards that I'm reviewing, I think to 43, which is 13 more than normal, which doesn't sound like a ton more, but it does actually add up to quite a lot more reviews and a bit like probably about 15 extra minutes a day. But I just kind of really want to make it this the week that I finish this list because after I do that, Gabriel Weiner recommended this grammar book that has tons of example French sentences that I'm going to work through so I can get a solid grasp of French grammar. I've just through these sentence examples that I found on websites, and as well as just watching and reading French material. I've learned actually a lot of grammar just through these examples, but I think it'll be worth it to go through this one book at least to get an understanding of how to use prepositions properly and adjectives, and not to mention all the verb conjugations, and at least just have a foothold so that at least I can recognize it. I'm not necessarily going to master grammar once I've gone through the book, but I'll have a strong foothold so that after that, I can learn the rest of grammar just through immersion, through examples, basically subconsciously. Because at the end of the day, language acquisition, at least according to Stephen Krashen, which I think it does make a lot of sense, language acquisition is a subconscious thing that you can plant the seeds, you can water the soil by doing efficient things like Anki or immersion and stuff, but it's not like a normal skill. You have to just let your brain get used to the language and basically training your brain to associate words and phrases with the ideas in your head in the new language. Instead of only thinking in terms of English, you can also think of the same similar idea in French in an idiomatic way. Yeah, anyway, so that's the plan. So starting next week, I'm going to be going through the particular grammar book that I got. And so I don't know how long that's going to take. Will that be a few weeks? Will that be a couple months? I don't know, but keep on moving forward. And then after that, I decided that my goal is to study the first Harry Potter book in French. Just take the translation, have a copy of it, and just power through it word like every single word I don't know, I'm gonna make a flashcard out of, like a closed deletion flashcard, and learn the vocabulary that way. I think there's something like 6,000 unique words in Harry Potter, the first book. I'm sure a bunch of those are just names and other things like that. I'm sure a whole bunch of them will be words I already know, but I'm sure there'll be at least 1,000 or two of words that I just have never seen before, and it'll be a great way to not only immerse myself in native material, but also increase my vocabulary from context. And at that point, I probably should have a pretty good vocabulary, probably 3,000 words, maybe. Again, that's several months down the line, but and then after that, as long as I'm continuing to watch TV, I've been watching the show Riverdale, dubbed in French, which is actually pretty fun because it's just teen drama and mystery, and so even if there's a lot good chunks I can't understand, I can generally get the gist of it. And then there's good chunks that I actually understand entire sentences, which is amazing. And so the more I watch it, the easier it gets, and the more it tunes my ear, and it does expose me to a lot of the language as well. So paired with the Anki stuff, I'm sure that will get easier and easier over time. And I think I think that's the plan, yeah. And hopefully we'll see how it goes. I mean, I don't know when I'll hit that tipping point. Some people call it the snowball effect, where you hit that intermediate level where it's very much self-reinforcing that just through reading and exposure to the language you will improve, as well as things like writing and speaking practice. Um, and I mean, I don't know how long I'll continue doing Anki, definitely for the foreseeable future, but it's generally recommended that once you hit that intermediate level, just go full in. I mean, use it to some extent, but you should be emphasizing so much more on just consuming native material and not as much on just these memorizing of these sentences. But again, the Yankees for the foothold. It's just a rocket ship to get you into orbit so that you can kind of coast on your intermediate abilities so that you can expose yourself to native material and advance from there. And because the stronger you are at a language, the more quickly you can actually acquire vocabulary because of all the context and stuff. But until I get there, full steam ahead with Anki. Again, like let's just look just to finish up. I can look at some of my statistics. I've been keeping up with this idea of putting cards in once a month, or not once a month, once a week. 210 cards every week, which has been really a good idea because during the week when I'm working, I just want to study and watch material. I don't want to have to like make flashcards because I actually don't mind making flashcards, but it can be a bit tiring and it's definitely not very much fun compared to actually studying. Uh, um, so this idea of making the cards on the weekend is a great strategy. I would recommend it to anyone. The last couple of days, it's actually taken me quite a bit longer to finish my reviews. 3 or 4 days ago, it only took me 30 minutes to finish my reviews, but the last couple of days took me a bit longer. I think it's because I'm not only trying to answer the sentences, uh, not only trying to answer the sentences like the fill in the blank words like le chien est dans la boîte. So if it's le blank est dans la boîte, so the answer would be chien. And I know not only am saying the whole sentence, I'm making sure to uh, silently read the sentence at least once before I move to the next card, which adds like 2 seconds to the time. But when you read, 200 cards, that adds up. And I think that adds a few more minutes, but I think it's worth it because, again, I think acquisition is all about getting used to the language instead of just the Pavlovian response of I know that the word fits in there. I want to just improve my ability to kind of sort of imagine and keep the whole concept of the sentence in my mind at the same time. So I've been experimenting with that. One other thing I've been experimenting with, or that I experimented and then quickly gave up on, was this idea of dedicated cards just to gender of nouns. So I came up with a mnemonic. I assigned two different actors from Star Trek to represent the gender, the masculine versus the feminine, and that was a disaster. I hated those cards so much. They were not fun to study. they weren't particularly effective at helping me remember. Maybe that just particular method, it works for some people, I think. It didn't work for me. I tried it, but I really hated studying that. And what I realized is that I'm going to learn the gender of nouns naturally through the context of these sentences. So I just, once in a while, I would, for like a new noun that I've never seen before, if it uses an article like le or un or la or un, I would make a flashcard, fill in the blank just for that article as a way to teach me the gender. And if there isn't an article, like if it's a plural noun, I just don't worry about it, honestly. Or if it starts with uh, a vowel, for example, and it uses a definite article, then again, I just don't worry about it because it's going to come up again eventually if it's an important word. And if I have to look it up at that point, then I'll be much more memorable at that point. But I'm not sweating the gender. I'm only using the context of the sentences and doing it that way. Because again, if the cards seem like really hard and annoying to do, it's very likely a bad flashcard. That's been my principle. But the sentences, which would be more difficult because there's a lot more information, have been a lot of fun to study and very easy to remember whole sentences, which sounds harder. So I stopped making those, and I basically deleted them all. But that being said, I don't think it's been hurting me at all to remember the genders. Just through the context alone has been good enough, I've found. What I'll now just to finish, actually, the last thing I'll show you is my new template for cards for French. So I basically modified an existing one, and it's called Justin's All-Purpose French Card. Okay, and so allows me to make flashcards very, very quickly. It's very similar to Gabriel Weiner's all-purpose flashcard, but there's a few modifications. So it, again, has a space for a sentence with the word blanked out for the closed deletion, the full sentence without any words blanked out for the answer, the single word that you're learning, the pictures that you're using. Now, the thing with the pictures is that I made sure that when you're making a new card, it keeps those pictures in that field, so you don't have to copy and paste them down on the bottom and then copy them over. So Gabriel Weiner recommends new pictures for every single different kind of flashcard for the same sentence. So far, it hasn't affected my comprehension to switch to keep the same picture. And in a way, the picture represents the whole story, which helps me remember. So I don't think it has made any difference keeping the same pictures so far for me. I made a field just for audio pronunciation that I got from forvo.com, as well as if the IPA information is available, then I'll copy and paste that in as well. Because I do actually find that useful if I forget how exactly to pronounce it, and at least be as somewhat of a guide. Even if my pronunciation is still pretty bad, it gives me some kind of guide to point me in the right direction. Over time, through enough immersion, I'm sure my pronunciation will improve, and I haven't even really been doing that much speaking practice, so I'm not too worried. Now, the front definitions base word, this is just for information about if it's some kind of verb conjugation, I'll put the infinitive version of it in here, and then as well as the tense that the version on the card will be. And which in a way sort of feels like it's cheating, but again, it's associating that conjugation with the infinitive. I think is super useful. There's a field just to make sure that you use two cards. It's for like the very like grammar-y stuff, like connecting words like de or a or la and stuff. I won't make two cards. I'll just be a fill in the blank for that because I don't want a million cards that says make up a sentence that uses the word de. I don't think that's very helpful, and potentially I could be making sentences that are grammatically incorrect or awkward or weird. But if it's always just fill in the blanks of, le chat est dans le blank bois, or les bonbons, non, j'ai toujours des bonbons blancs montent dans ma poche, or something. So like the fill in the blank would be à la. So I wouldn't make a flashcard like where it just says à la and I have to come up with a sentence. Certain little phrases I might for that, but for those like weird grammar connecting words, I don't need that second card, and I don't think it's particularly useful. The next two forms, this is kind of a leftover of my efficient way of creating gender testing flashcards. I didn't bother changing the field name, but now what happens is if it's a noun, a masculine noun, and I put yes here, instead of creating a brand new flashcard, it'll just put gender information on the answer flashcard. So it'll just say le or and I'll say like masculine or feminine. just to give you a little bit of extra information when you're reviewing the card. Again, it's not testing you on the gender, but it gives you that extra information. And hopefully if I'm making, just through the sentence exposure as well as maybe specific flashcards for la and la on those sentences, that'll be enough to cover gender. So I'm not testing gender specifically with these fields, it just gives you extra information on the cards. So it just makes it very efficient to create cards. So as far as I can tell, I don't think there's any way to make this any more efficient. I feel like this is like done. This is perfect for me and my workflow. I can make flashcards very quickly. Again, it takes me a bit of time, like 90 an hour or two for 200 cards, but that's with sentences, pictures, audio. All right. Well, that's my video. That's my 60 days experience, and like I said, so far so good. I am retaining the information according to Anki. I definitely seem to be learning a lot, although subjectively, do I feel like I know twice as much compared to last month? It doesn't really feel that way. It still feels like I'm very much laying the foundation and planting the seeds and watering the soil. It doesn't feel like, it certainly doesn't feel like I've hit any kind of intermediate level yet. I'm still very much a beginner, but now that I've gone through this list and can start learning grammar and I'm continuing to immerse, well, I guess we'll just have to see what happens after a month, because I don't think I could actually learn much quicker than I am. Like, the amount of sentences and words I'm learning, I don't think you could keep up much faster pace than I am. And I probably could immerse a little bit more, read and watch more stuff, but I've started to do about an hour a day, so that should cover it. So I don't think I can go any faster, so we'll see what happens. I don't think I'm necessarily studying at the most optimal, but it's pretty close, I would say, without dedicating my entire life to it. But, well, I guess we'll just have to see after another 30 days what my progress is. Anyways, thank you.